Oh, you're on mute. Sorry.
I was just asking if you could see my screen, but good to know I was also on mute.
We can
Um,
see your screen and it's in presenter view, so it looks great.
okay, awesome. Thank you so much, Marianne, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak to Land of Lakes Bird Alliance today. And thank you everyone for coming. I'm super excited to share some of my I guess, spooky adjacent research on this spooky week. In fact, I'm in Ottawa in Ontario right now, and we have a massive thunderstorm happening outside. So that feels like a good ambiance for this talk, perhaps. So, just a little bit about me before we get into it. So I recently completed just this year my PhD in human geography at Queen's University in Ontario. And while I was at Queen's doing my PhD, I also spent a period as a visiting student researcher at Cornell University, where I did a lot of the research that I'm going to talk about today. I'm currently a environmental history lecturer at Trent University in Ontario. And I feel I have to be very clear on the point that I'm not an ornithologist or indeed a particularly accomplished birder. But I'm very interested in human relationships with birds. That I suppose is my expertise and the thing I'm interested in. But I've always loved nature and animals. And I feel a lot of people who study birds decide to study birds because they have a love for birds. But for me, it was kind of the opposite. I was interested in human nature relationships. And that led me to being interested in human bird relationships. And then through kind of studying that, it led me to a love of birds themselves. So I'm a very much a baby birder, I suppose, and still learning a lot. But yeah, big fan of birds, of course. But yeah, I just included these images in the bottom corner here because I came to be interested in the relationship between humans and birds when I was doing my master's degree in Brighton in the UK, where I saw that there was this very kind of intense and specific relationship that people have with gulls there in these quite kind of dramatic and kind of villainous ways at times, with kind of the girls really being villainized. Like you cannot eat food outside in Brighton without a girl kind of wanting to take a bite of it. But also in this kind of like soft and kind of nostalgic way where they're kind of these pictures of the city. So that was kind of my first bit of research into human bird relationships. And then when I came to Canada, I was very lucky to meet Dr. Laura Jean Cameron, who is in this call today, who is my PhD supervisor. And she did some really, really interesting research about the relationships between humans and birds, I suppose, as it relates to history and as it relates to bird sound. And she did and is still doing some really fantastic research on that front to do with William Gunn, who was a really prolific sound recordist in Canada. So that was kind of my entry, and she really got me riled up about what is interesting about historical bird sound recordings. And so I decided to have my PhD to be about that. So I'm really interested in what we can learn about nature-society relationships through sound and through sound recording. And some of the questions I think about are how, why, and at what cost do humans use sound to encounter and learn about birds? What does it mean to consider bird sound recordings as cultural artifacts rather than just scientific data points? And I think about this a lot kind of in the context of today and how we often encounter bird sound recordings. So, of course, I'm sure that you've all experienced Merlin Sound ID and the Macaulay Library and these massive kind of big data stores that we have of bird sounds and kind of how they're used in these machine learning algorithms for kind of educational and scientific purposes. Which I think is really amazing. But I also think, kind of in that context, some of these rich contexts of specific recordings are being lost. So I was kind of just interested to think about, okay, well, as well as being these interesting scientific data points, and as part of these kind of big data ecosystems, what are they? What does it mean to kind of think about them on kind of that more individual and maybe cultural and historical level? And then I came interested in kind of on that line of what we can learn from studying the collection and afterlives of particular bird sound recordings. So really kind of going to that minute thing of finding, individual sound recordings in the same way that we might look at an individual skin of a bird or something like that. And kind of really interrogate those kind of individual objects. And one thing I quickly found when I was doing my research was that these questions became a lot more interesting in the context of extinction. And that's kind of be the second half of my talk is talking about the context of extinction. But I've included a picture here of one of the many boxes of archival material that I went through when I was doing this research. So I spent about 6 months locked, well, not quite locked, but I suppose metaphorically locked in the basement of the Cornell University library, where they have this amazing archive that's open to the public that of all of the historical correspondence of the founding of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology through the 20th century, and all this amazing correspondence between the staff of the library and this kind of amazing international network of bird sound recordists, as well as kind of other ornithologists. So I was really digging through that material, and a lot of the things I'm going to talk about today are things I found in that. And also during my research, like I said, I focus on the history and the collection of these recordings, but also the afterlives and kind of how these recordings still have a presence, like scientifically or culturally, in the present day. So I also did a lot of interviews with scientists and archivists and artists and things like that as part of this research. So I just included here some of the things that I've published and written about in this area. As you can see, spoiler alert, a lot of the research had to do with the ivory-billed woodpecker in the end, which was not an intention going in, but just ended up being a really fascinating portion of this research, which I'll get into. But I've also thought more broadly about what it means to have have sound recordings of extinct animals, and especially extinct birds, because this is a very new phenomenon. And like Marianne said in the introduction, we don't usually think about sound when we think about extinct birds or extinct creatures. So what does it mean to have those sound recordings? And then more broadly, I've also thought about just the history of bird sound recording more generally as a scientific and cultural practice, which is important context for the other kind of extinction related stuff. And so I'll talk through that in this presentation a bit too. So just in terms of the structure of this talk, I was so excited to be invited to give this talk that I put way too much in this presentation. So there's going to be a few things that I'll kind of go over a little bit more quickly than perhaps I originally intended to, but hopefully it still kind of comes across as a coherent presentation, and perhaps we can think of this a little bit more of kind of whistle-stop tour of various things along the way of thinking about bird sound recording and its history, practices, and meaning as it relates to extinction. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about the extinction of sound as kind of a scene setting for this presentation. Then I'm going to talk more broadly about the history of bird sound recording, particularly around the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And before kind of transitioning into thinking a little bit about how they built the library that we know today of being this massive comprehensive archive, which is the Macaulay Library, which contains millions of recordings of birds and kind of its early days and how they kind of saw that growing. Then I'm going to talk a bit about the colonial entanglements of the archive and maybe some of the more troubling history that hasn't been talked about in terms of bird sound recording that I discovered in my research before kind of diving in a bit more to the sounds of extinction with case studies around the ivory-billed woodpecker and the Hawaiian crow. So very briefly, I wanted to talk about the extinction of sound. This isn't so much my research specifically, but something that has always been propelling my interest in this area when I think about birds and sound and extinction. Not only do I think about the sound recordings of extinct birds, but also kind of the context of sensory extinction. So for a long time, sounds or the lack of sounds have been considered a sign of ecological health or lack of ecological health. And of course, a very famous example of this is Rachel Carson's famous 1952 book, I believe, of The Silent Spring, where she talked about how kind of a declining ecological health could be heard in the fact that we couldn't hear birds and we would have a spring without birdsong. So many really amazing researchers have recently, and artists and sound recordists have been thinking about framing sounds and soundscapes. So rather than landscapes, they might think of soundscapes as themselves an object of endangerment or concern. And this is called soundscape ecology. And in this framework, they think of sounds as being something or some place in need of protection. And someone who is a really big proponent of this school of thought is Bernie Krause, who is a really accomplished sound recordist who kind of really points out the declining sort of sonic diversity that he hears and he's able to record. And he kind of calls this the biophony. And in the same way that we think of an ecological niche as being a particular species inhabiting an ecological niche, he talks about the acoustic niche, so that the whole world is kind of this great animal orchestra, and each species has a very particular niche at which they can communicate with one another. And if some of those species go extinct or if their voices are drowned out because of the sounds of humans and machines and things like that, then that can disrupt this very delicate ecosystem. So this is kind of the idea of this school of thought and this idea of sound itself as an object of concern. And there are lots of proponents for this, and I've kind of included some of the images there. And all this is to say that you likely hear a lot fewer birds in your daily life than your grandparents used to, and your grandchildren will probably hear even less. US and Canadian bird populations have fallen by 3 billion individuals since 1970, which is a catastrophic decline, which reaches every biome in North America. And of course, we're all bird inclined people here, so I'm sure we're very aware of those losses and the kind of biological and cultural impacts of those. And to make matters worse, modern noises mask birds' calls. So even those who are still kind of surviving, it's more and more difficult for them to communicate with each other. But in another way, we're able to hear more birds than ever before. So this is kind of where my research comes in. So like I've mentioned, the Macaulay Library, which is a massive multimedia scientific archive that is run by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. It's the world's largest wildlife sound archive. In December of 2023, the website passed 2 million recordings of birds, and it's even more now, sorry, birds and other natural phenomena, but most of the recordings are of birds. And these are captured by almost 40,000 individual recordists. And this is kind of quite an amazing feat that this 2 million mark was passed, because only 2 years prior to that, the 1 million mark was passed. So you can kind of see/hear that this is kind of an exponential growth. And as of 2023, the collection included 99% of the world's known bird species, sounds of them. And so most of the recordings that you can hear on the Macaulay Library are ones that are uploaded directly by contributors. So whether that be kind of professional field recordists or ornithologists or amateur birders, people can just take recordings in their back gardens even and upload those. One thing that I'm very interested in is the recordings that have been uploaded, that are digitized recordings from all the way back in 1923. So these kind of exist side by side. So the Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology is obviously very much today considered to be a center, kind of global center for bird sound recording and bird sound recordings. And it has kind of always been this way since its very inception. So just a little bit of history about the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. So of course, it's now probably the world's well, one of the world's most well-known scientific institutions, and certainly the world's most well-known ornithological institution. And it began very humbly back in 1915, when Arthur A. Allen, who's the fellow you can see on the right here, placed a cardboard sign on his door in Cornell that just simply said Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology. And of course, today that's become what we now know as the Lab of O. Though the lab had and still has a very broad scientific remit, it's of course not just about bird sound recording. Bird sound recording has always been very much core to its identity and its purpose. So the very first recording of a wild bird by the lab, and actually the very first recording of a wild bird by anyone in North America, was captured in 1929 in Ithaca when, with the help of the Fox Corporation and its extremely expensive optical sound recording equipment. And it was a recording of a song sparrow that was captured in 1929 in Ithaca Stewart Park. And hopefully you're able to hear this. Otherwise, I'm a little worried that I didn't do the right thing with sharing the sound.
LNS catalog number 16737.
Right, let me know if that's playing. Okay, I can't see the chat, but hopefully you can you could hear that. It's thumbs up. Okay, thank you, Marianne. The sound is very critical. So that was the very first sound recording of a wild bird that was ever taken in the United States, which I think is and North America, which I think is really amazing. And you can listen to that digitized today on the Macaulay Library alongside a bunch of other historical digitized recordings. So Peter Paul Kellogg, who is a character who will follow us throughout this presentation, is the fellow in the middle here. And he was one of the ornithologists and recordists who was part of that very first recording experiment. He was an ornithologist, but also an electronics expert. And he just became obsessed with trying to record, to try and kind of perfect the techniques and technologies for wild bird sound recording. And he was assisted both by his colleagues at Cornell, as well as this broad international network of recordists and specialists who we will talk about in this presentation. So what became what we now know as the Lab of Ornithology, what we now know as the Macaulay Library, and what was back then the Cornell Library of Natural Sounds, was really enabled by this man here, Albert R. Brand, who was a retired stock trader who had a lot of money and was also a very keen ornithologist and someone very interested in the recording of birds. And he established this endowment, which allowed the Cornell Library of Natural Sounds to exist.
LNS kit.
And so I mentioned the Fox Corporation, and it was their movie tone, super expensive, super heavy optical sound recording equipment, which is way too complex of a thing for me to understand or for me to explain to you. But it was this really kind of nifty sound recording hardware, which was used in the very early days. And though this was really exciting, that kind of portable sound recording was able to exist, it was not very accessible and it was not very easy to move. And so the kind of uptake in bird sound recording as an activity that kind of any old person could do was very slow until around the 1950s, when truly portable tape recorders, like those we can see on the right of the screen here, became released to the public. And so 1950s is really the period at which we see this big uptick in the Cornell Library of Natural Sounds and what they have in their archive as a result of that kind of portable field recorder. And in 1964, the library had 18,000 cuts of wildlife sound. So one thing that I found when I was in the archive reading the correspondence of Peter Paul Kellogg is that from the very start, he really did have this goal of building a comprehensive and global archive of the world's birds for scientific study. So what we can see today as the Macaulay Library is really exactly what Kellogg had in mind almost 100 years ago when he first started this endeavor. So interestingly, when they kind of began this mission, though, bird sound recording was a pretty difficult thing to sell ornithologists on. It was skin collecting was still very much the vogue of this time, and they didn't really understand the scientific utility of bird sound recordings or why we might want to collect those. And so Kellogg really had to go on this kind of international ambassadorship of trying to convince ornithologists and hobbyist birders and all kinds of folks to record the sounds of birds. And for Kellogg, he really saw the scientific utility of the archive, not so much in the individual bird sound recordings, but in having this comprehensive collection that you could compare over time and over space and over species. So that was why it was really important for him to kind of go on this kind of evangelical mission of converting people into bird sound recordists so that they could create this library. And so due to the geographical location of Cornell, they could quite easily which is in upstate New York, they could quite easily collect bird sound recordings from kind of the Northeast. But anywhere further than that required a lot of this kind of ambassadorship that I was mentioning. So Kellogg would go around to different birding societies like this one to try and convince people to record the sounds of birds. And he would also write letters to people that he knew who were stationed, usually Americans and British people who were stationed overseas for business or for government or even for war, to try and convince them to record the sounds of birds kind of while they were there, so that the archive could become more global. And usually those people were businessmen or lofty government officials who would have bird sound recording as a hobby, perhaps not too much unlike today. It was not the most lucrative endeavor, and it was sort of more something that you did out of love. Although of course today it can be kind of a career, and but back then it certainly wasn't. It would be something that people who had enough money to spend on the equipment could do kind of in their free time. So some examples is we have at the top here, we have George B. Renard, who was a botanist for the Campbell Soup Corporation, and he would be sent to Caribbean islands to survey okra crops, because at the time that was sort of their secret ingredient of their tomato soup. And in his spare time, of course, he would record birds. And then at the bottom here, we have William Ward, who I'll talk a bit later. And he was a executive for the Bank of Hawaii. And so, of course, also a very rich person who would record birds in his free time. And these men, and as well, often in a very under-acknowledged way, were supported hugely by both local guides and their wives. But this is often kind of went unacknowledged. But they collectively contributed thousands and thousands of recordings to the Cornell Library of Natural Sounds, some of which are now digitized on the Macaulay Library website. So I don't have time to go into this part of things, but a constant issue early on in the Cornell Library of Natural Sounds was funding. They were almost kind of always on the brink of extinction themselves, and so they would come out with these vinyl records of these different places to try and kind of fund their endeavors. And some of these have been digitized on YouTube actually, and are quite interesting to listen to. But we don't have time to go into that now, but that's okay. One thing I do want to talk about a little bit, which is perhaps a slightly uncomfortable thing, which I encountered in my research, uncomfortable, but perhaps not surprising, and really quite difficult to ignore because it came up so much, was the entanglement of the project of bird sound recording and the founding of the Cornell Library of Natural Sounds with the project of colonialism. So one of the most illuminating insights was less so in what could be heard in the sound recordings themselves or what could be heard in those vinyl records, but what was kind of deliberately excluded from those things, or things that were sort of hidden in various correspondences. And so for that reason hasn't really come up before for other people who have done histories of bird sound recording and of the Cornell Library of Natural Sounds. So to kind of bring a specific example, one of the most prolific contributors to the Cornell Library of Natural Sciences' early years was a fellow called Miles E.W. North, who was a district commissioner for Kenya, and he was British. And basically what that means is that he worked for the colonial government during kind of the final years of formal colonial rule of the British in Kenya. So these are a few different quotes that of many, many quotes that I pulled out from his correspondence, which I'll sort of leave on the screen here and start to pick out. But he was extremely candid and detailed about his non-birding activities in his correspondence with Kellogg, which kind of ostensibly was supposed to be a correspondence about bird sound recording, but kind of, you know, they became friends. And so Miles North would share a lot about his personal and business and government public servant life they go with Kellogg. So what it all became for me particularly striking during the process of decolonization in Kenya, and particularly during what is known as the Mau Mau uprising, or what's known as the Kenya emergency, which was when the Kenya Land of Freedom Army, or the Mau Mau, were at war with the British colonial state. So this was between 1952 and 1960, which also happened to correspond with the time where Miles North was collecting most of his bird sound recordings. So this period is widely considered to be one of the most unjust periods of recent colonial history, and the worst being during the period of 1952 and 1960, as I mentioned, where over 100,000 Kenyans were killed, tortured, or maimed by British colonial authorities. And as you can see in these quotes here, North's involvement with this violence was not passive or merely by association, and it was not by any means separate from his bird sound recording activities. In his correspondence with Kellogg, he would weave descriptions of his work in the colonial government with discussions of bird sound recording technologies and techniques, and even kind of talk with this quite kind of jovial irritation about how his kind of colonial endeavors would get in the way or perhaps help him with his bird sound recording activities. And as you can see in these quotes, he was quite kind of directly involved with the trying and the torturing of freedom fighters in Kenya. So this kind of entanglement of bird sound recording and coloniality, which I saw most prevalently in Miles North, can also be seen in many, many other instances in the early years of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. So one thing that I'll again talk a little bit more about later is that they would often, when they were going on these trips to record birds, they would often not just record birds, but also record people. So you can see in the final paragraph here, which as part of this memorandum for a 1956 Cornell expedition to record birds in Africa, in Kenya, specifically, that not only did they record birds, but they saw this as kind of this great opportunity to study and record the Turkana tribes of Northwest Kenya. So really kind of seeing these groups as kind of part of like the nature and the natural sounds that they might be able to collect. And of course, that being quite an infantilizing and extractive view of these people. And also one thing that's interesting about this memorandum is earlier on, you can see that they acknowledge that, quote, 20 native boys that they employed to look after their welfare. And so again, you can see how these kind of local individuals are really generally obscured from the record. When we talk about bird sound recording and the building of what's now the Macaulay Library, we often think of these specific individuals who were these kind of individual contributors or individual donors, but there are all of these people kind of behind the scenes who are often included in these histories, which I think is important to note. So another example here, you can see that when McChesney, who is another kind of occasional contributor to the lab, who spent a lot of time in Africa, was donating a fair few of his sounds to the lab in the 1960s, that he donated not only these bird sounds, but also these sounds of people. And what I find most interesting about this letter is that he doesn't differentiate. He doesn't say, here are the sounds of the birds and the animals, and here are the sounds of the people. He just says, here are recordings that need to be in the Library of Natural Sounds at the Lab of Ornithology, without really much comment on why recordings of Indigenous people should be included alongside the sounds of birds, whereas the sounds of other people perhaps might not be included. So this is really all to say, is just when we're thinking about the sound recordings of birds and kind of the history of bird sound recording, that we need to remember that there's no such thing as this kind of neutral ear or this ear from nowhere. That sound recordings, the bird sound recordings were and still are kind of collected within these very specific kind of cultural historical contexts, with very kind of specific framings and ideals and people involved. And this is kind of part of this broader academic history kind of thought around science as not being a neutral endeavor. And so I think that's quite interesting to think about when we think about bird sound recordings. And this is not to say that we shouldn't listen to the bird sound recordings captured by these people, or that they can't be scientifically or culturally enriching. But for me, it's just evidence for why we really need to think of these recordings as and the project of bird sound recording as sort of a cultural and historical endeavor that demands critical interrogation. And I think this is particularly important, as I noted earlier, when we think about the current kind of state of how we encounter the sounds of birds in these kind of big data contexts, where the kind of very specific cultural historical specifics around each recording and the people doing the recording and the place they were doing those recordings are really lost in that context, and maybe the importance of as much as we can thinking about those things a little bit too, and also kind of questioning the ways in which we record the sounds of birds today. So with that kind of background, I suppose, on the history of bird sound recording, I want to transition to talking about bird sound recording and bird sound recordings as they relate to extinction. So the question here being, what can we learn from following the collection and afterlives of specific bird sound recordings, particularly in the context of extinction? So this wasn't something that I necessarily intended to research, but I found that in reading the correspondence of early bird sound recordists, and also talking to people today about kind of the significance of both historical bird sound recordings in the present day and kind of present bird sound recordings, that extinction and bird loss and habitat loss and sonic loss was something that came up again and again and again as something that we think about when we think about bird sound recording. And so I became very interested in this area, so much so that I kind of really honed in on these, what ended up being 3 very specific bird sound recordings, so individual recordings that were collected historically by some of the gentlemen who I mentioned so far in this presentation, and just really wanting to dig into the sound recordings of extinct or almost extinct or endangered birds, and wondering kind of what it means to have those sound recordings, how they were collected and why, and what kind of the impact of having those bird sound recordings have been on human relationships with those species. I found some really kind of amazing stories surrounding these specific recordings, both historically and in the present. And I found that kind of the general way that we communicate academic knowledge, which of course is through academic articles and books, wasn't quite sufficient for telling these stories. So as part of my PhD research, I made a podcast called Last Call for Lost Birds, which isn't public yet, but perhaps I will be brave enough to make it public at some point. But it was a 3-part kind of mini series where I talked about these specific bird sound recordings of extinct or endangered birds, and what's interesting about them and what we can learn about them. So I'm going to talk about 2 of those today. So this is, of course, the Ivory-billed Woodpecker, and this is the Hawaiian Crow, and this is the Puerto-Rican Nightjar. Fortunately, we don't have time to talk about the Puerto-Rican Nightjar today. We'll just be talking about the Ivory-billed Woodpecker and the Hawaiian Crow. So let's start with what might be a slightly controversial topic to some, which is the Ivory-billed Woodpecker. So for some context, from the very start, Cornell recordists and their international networks, as I mentioned, were obsessed with recording not only as many birds as possible, but especially recording the sounds of endangered species before it was too late. So in 1935, Allen, Kellogg, which are 2 people I've mentioned already, but also a few others, mounted this cross-country expedition in the United States. And this was almost immediately after they'd figured out how to record the sounds of wild birds. Their first thought was that they wanted to make sure that they were recording the sounds of vanishing species before it was too late. The kind of extinction crisis was just kind of entering the public imaginary at this time. And it was something that they were all really concerned about. And especially Arthur A. Allen, who is the founder of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, was very concerned about extinction and the ability for future generations, so us, really, to be able to hear the sounds of these birds before they were lost. So I just want to read this passage, which is from the book that they created about the 1935 expedition that they went on. So they say, years have passed since the cooing of the passenger pigeons was a common sound throughout eastern North America. The tooting of the heath hen, the quack of the Labrador duck, and the grunt of the great auk are sounds which have passed forever from this good world and even from the memory of man. Still other sounds of nature which were familiar to our ancestors are now seldom, if ever, heard, and many of these prove soon to be entirely lost. It was with this thought in mind that they made this expedition in the spring of 1935, the object of which should be to perpetuate for all time the voices of such American birds which, because of their rarity, have been given promise of soon becoming but forgotten memories. So I find this quote really compelling for lots of reasons, but also, like I mentioned, just that they were really, really they really knew or really thought that the sounds of these extinct species or endangered species would be meaningful to us in the future. And they really wanted to capture them for our kind of cultural and scientific enrichment. And of course, now that sadly, many of the bird species that were recorded during this time are becoming extinct or further endangered, we can kind of see their dreams come into reality, and of course a very sad way, but also kind of shows their ongoing legacy and the work that they've done. So that's one of the things that kind of propels me thinking about what does it mean to have these recordings of extinct birds. They wanted us to have them, and now we have them, and what does that change? How has that changed how we relate to these species, and perhaps whether or not they go extinct? So can these sounds have a role in halting extinctions? So back to this 1935 expedition. So they recorded a ton of different birds, both endangered and not endangered, but really the crown jewel of the expedition was the first and still the only ever sound recordings of the iconic Ivory-billed woodpecker. So even in 1935, there was really considerable doubt about whether the ivory bill was extinct or not. So this is not a new debate. This has been a debate for many, many years. But the recorders on this expedition were really determined. One of them had seen one several years prior, and they really thought that they were going to be able to find one. And luckily, after much planning and effort, the team were eventually led to an ivory-bill nest in northern Louisiana by a local game ranger named J.J. Kuhn. And so when they went on this big cross-country expedition, as you can see in the bottom left here, they had this massive truck with all their sound equipment and everything in it, because sound recording was still not that portable then, but just portable enough. But the general habitat of ivory bills, as I'm going to go into a bit more, is this really dense swampland, which you can't get a truck like that into. So they had to kind of decant their recording gear into a donkey-drawn cart that was owned by this man called Ike, who led them into the forest and to the ivory-bill nest. So the top left photo that you can see here is of that kind of decanted truck into a cart. So from this space where they were able to observe this ivory-bill nest tree, Alan Kellogg and their team spent several days observing and recording a single pair of ivory bills. The resulting recording series, which you can now listen to, freely available on the Cornell's Macaulay Library website, is quite arresting. The bird's disarming nasal joust, which is known as a Kent call, cuts through the crackly ambience of the audibly ancient recording technology. So I'm going to play a bit for you now.
LNS catalog number 6784.
Yeah, so that's a Kent call. So it's often kind of said to sound like blowing through a clarinet mouthpiece or the false note of a trumpet. And that is the only undisputed sound recording that exists of an ivory-billed woodpecker. And it was collected all the way back in 1935. So there's obviously a lot of layers of death and absence when we listen to that recording, right? Because not only is the ivory bill who made that sound dead, but potentially all ivory bills are now gone from the world. The recordists who made the recording are no longer with us. The technologies are obsolete. And in fact, the original tape recording of that, the original tape of that recording has also been lost. In fact, it was deliberately set on fire, which is a different tangent that I can go down. But there's so many layers of absence and death when we listen to that recording. But also, there also lies some kind of life in that recording, and potentially the key to bringing the species back to life. So before I go into that too much, quick context about the ivory bill, if one can do quick context about the ivory bill for those who are perhaps not so familiar with this story. So the ivory bill is, or perhaps was, the largest species of woodpecker in North America. Sort of looks a bit like a pileated woodpecker, but a lot bigger and with different kind of behaviors and different feather patterns on it. And it's kind of been dipping in and out of extinction ever since the early 20th century. The last undisputed sighting happened all the way back in 1944, but ever since then, there's been various kind of claimed sightings of various persuasiveness. Most famously in 2005, the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, in fact, in the modern day, kind of came out to say that they rediscovered the species, and there was a lot of excitement about that. And some images, which is part of the evidence they presented, is at the top here. And kind of over time, people became less convinced that they had actually found ivory-billed woodpeckers. And that's sort of the story when it comes to kind of all of these claimed sightings, that they're never kind of quite enough to convince everyone kind of unequivocally that the bird is still there. And there's a ton of debate around it, but we could talk a lot more about that, of course. But I think that's all we kind of need to know for this. Other than that, perhaps more so than any other creature thought to be extinct or endangered creature, many people have really become obsessed with trying to find this species, kind of devoting their lives and even their life savings to try and find this species, partly because of just a love for this bird in particular, and it's kind of big and beautiful and very culturally important, but also kind of this belief of it being kind of a symbol of the the southern wilds, and that potentially if we found it, then we could protect more of the land there. But part of the problem is that if it is not extinct, and even when it was a bit more abundant, the places in which it's found are these very kind of dense swamplands, as I mentioned earlier, that are quite hard to traverse through. They're quite hard to see through, so a bird could easily be hiding behind a thicket of trees. And so if they are still out there, they're a very difficult bird to find. And many people postulate that the species is very shy and skittish too. So the kind of analogy I use is that looking for an ivory bill is a bit like trying to find a very shy needle in a very thick haystack. And so kind of in that context, sound has emerged as being a very, very important tool for trying to search for the species. So that's where we make this connection with that 1935 recording. So although there are kind of many alleged sound recordings of ivory bills, as I mentioned, that 1935 recording is really the only universally accepted one. And so in this context, that 1935 recording, that very crackly, sort of ancient sounding one that we just heard, has become this really important piece of evidence and piece of knowledge and field tool and benchmark in these modern searches to try and find the ivory bill and potentially halting its extinction. So for starters, the recordings provide an invaluable model from which searchers can learn from. So as well as descriptions of their sounds from ivory bill observers all the way back to John James Audubon, Allen and Kellogg's recordings help searchers to know what they're listening for when they're listening to ivory bills. In addition, the recordings offer a type specimen from which any alleged new sound recordings of ivory bills can be measured against, and this is kind of used as a tool time and time again in published research that comes out about kind of claimed rediscoveries of the ivory bill. So you can see on the right here, this is a spectrogram of ivory-billed woodpecker calls that's based on those 1935 recordings. So you can see that kind of pictorially, the recordings have this very distinctive structure. It's called this ladder-like pattern that are quite kind of discrete. And so when people are analyzing their recordings of ivory bills, this is really what they're looking for. So you can see an example of this here from a 2006-2008 search for ivory bills in Florida by Jeffrey Hill and other colleagues at Auburn University. This is the 1935 recording, and then these are some of the recordings they took. So their kind of argument was that these are similar enough kind of visually to these ones to suggest that it might be an ivory-billed woodpecker. And what kind of this does is that rather than saying, oh, that kind of sounds like an ivory bill, you can kind of do these quantitative measurements of these pictures. But perhaps the most fascinating use of the 1935 recordings in modern attempts to find the ivory-billed woodpecker for me is in the phenomenon of playback. So this is kind of irrelevant to these pictures here, but just to give you a bit of a picture of ivory bill searching in the modern day. So on the left we have some searchers here who, as you can see in this very, very dense swampland, looking for ivory bills by canoe. And on the right here, we have what are called ARUs, which are autonomous recording units, which in ivory bill searches, as well as in many other kind of scientific field work, set up in all these different trees to kind of constantly record to try and see if any recordings of potential ivory bills are picked up. So anyway, back to playback. So many of you will know that playback is a very common method in all kinds of outdoor activities, whether it be birding, hunting, or conservation, in which animal sound recordings are played out in natural areas in order to provoke a specific response from wildlife. So a very common and perhaps controversial example is when bird photographers might play out a species call in order to encourage a given bird to come closer to the camera. The reason that being controversial is it's sort of introducing potentially stressing the bird and sort of introducing non-natural sounds into a soundscape. But in ivory-bill searches, playback is used quite similarly to the way that we might use it today. So the 1935 recordings, that we might use it in our kind of everyday life. So the 1935 recordings have been played out from speakers in promising habitats in order to trick surviving ivory bills into calling back, or better yet, to be lured towards the sounds and visually reveal themselves to searchers. So there are many, many accounts of this being successful, of ivory bill searchers playing out the 1935 recordings and hearing what they think, or hearing or potentially seeing an ivory bill in response. So there's one account from ornithologist and noted ivory bill searcher Jerome A. Jackson in 1987. So this was before he could access the Macaulay Library on his phone. He had a tape copy of the 1935 recordings that he played out in Mississippi, and says that he both heard and saw an ivory bill in response to this. And also more recently, now that kind of anyone can do this, because we can all kind of access the Macaulay Library from our phones and play them out on Bluetooth speakers, there have been many accounts of people either hearing or seeing ivory bills in response to playback, though none of these have resulted in definitive evidence. And though that these have not led to definitive proof of the species, they have helped keep the hope of ivory bill survival alive for searchers. So if they hear a sound or see an ivory bill, or what they believe to be an ivory bill in response, then it sort of encourages them to keep searching and know kind of the areas in which they might want to search for. But just like playback is controversial in bird photography, it's also very controversial in ivory bill searching. So many searchers actually ban the use of playback altogether in their searches. And there are several reasons for this. So for starters, many believe that it isn't actually a very helpful field method because digital sound doesn't carry very far through the dense kind of swampy forests that ivory bills might be found, and also these massive search areas that are being looked for. And so instead, a lot of ivory bill searchers will employ mechanical double knocks. So double knocks are the other sounds, sort of known sounds that are made by ivory bills, which are made by other Campephalus woodpecker species like powerful woodpeckers and pale-billed woodpeckers in South America. And these are quite a distinctive sound. Anyway, you can make them quite easily, or sort of good enough version of them quite easily, through banging sticks against a tree, or canoe paddles have been used before, and there's a picture of this happening at the bottom there, or in perhaps more sophisticated versions, Martin Lamertink, who was a lead scientist on Cornell searches for the ivory bill, actually created this double knocker tool specifically for this purpose. So that's one reason why people might not use playback, because they decided to use double knocker tools or double knocks instead. But for some searchers, really any kind of sonic mimicry, so whether it being the playback of the 1935 recordings or the mechanical double knocks, are considered to be highly problematic. In fact, some searchers worry that they could actually scare away ivory bills rather than luring them in. There's a lot that we don't know about ivory bills, and some believe that they might be quite territorial birds who would be repelled away from the area if they heard recorded sounds of other ivory bills or the double knock sounds. And a lot of the concern around this actually comes from the context in which the 1935 recordings were collected in the first place. If you read the accompanying field notes to the 1935 expedition, the recordists, so Allen and Kellogg, detail some quite invasive means through which they captured the recordings. So they would bang against the nest tree or sort of make kind of hand gestures to get the ivory bills to come out of their nest and make sound so that they could be recorded. And many people today kind of postulate that therefore the sounds that they recorded might not have been kind of the normal behavior of the ivory bills. And in fact, a few weeks after those 1935 recordings were captured, Allen and Kellogg went back to that nest tree where they recorded ivory bills, and the nest tree had been abandoned. And so some have postulated that the reason that the nest tree was empty might be because the birds were irritated and scared off by the actions of the recordists, and so the recordings might have actually captured ivory bill alarm calls. So if you're then playing that out into a forest, trying to lure ivory bills in, you might actually be scaring them away. But perhaps the biggest worry of all when we think about playback is that they could corrupt the search areas, that other searchers or even other birds might hear the sounds and believe they're actually hearing ivory bills. This isn't an unfounded concern. In the very early days of Cornell searches, they picked up what they thought was the perfect ivory bill call, and they couldn't kind of believe their ears. That they had kind of rediscovered the ivory bill through sound, but then it kind of turned out later on that what they'd actually captured was someone else doing a playback with the 1935 recordings. So no wonder it sounded so similar, because it was the same sound. And then a kind of other really sort of mind-bending thing is that if you did playback too much, then mimicking species in the region might then pick up on those sounds. So for instance, blue jays might hear and start to mimic the playback sounds of ivory bills, which then might confuse searchers even further, who might think they're hearing ivory bills, but they're actually hearing a mimicking species doing a version of the ivory bill calls. So yes, this is a very kind of convoluted picture. But I say all this because regardless of the controversies of playback, we can see kind of through this story that the historical recordings remain a really crucial bit of the toolkit for modern searchers. So whether training searchers what to listen for, being benchmarks to compare new recordings against, or being deployed as search tools in of themselves, Allen and Kellogg's 1935 recordings worked to bring us closer to the ivory-billed woodpecker, exactly like Allen and his colleagues had intended, though probably a bit more literally than they ever thought possible. So I don't think I'm going to have too much time to go really far into the second case study that I was going to share with you all today. But I just want to kind of give context about how this desire to record birds before it was too late was shared by many Cornell associates, and is even quite a propelling force for many bird sound recordists today. And many of you may have, I'm sure that you heard in 2021, the announcement from the US Fish and Wildlife Service that they recommended removing 23 apparently extinct species from the endangered species list. And when I saw this news, I was interested to learn how many of those 11 species of birds that were recommended to be delisted due to extinction had bird sound recordings of them. And I found that of the birds listed as extinct, 6 of them were recorded while they were still present. And actually, I believe that the processing around whether or not these birds are extinct is still ongoing, partly because of the controversies around the ivory-billed woodpecker. But regardless, these are some of the first confirmed extinct species for which we have sound recordings of them. So like I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, this is a really new phenomenon, this idea of having sound recordings of extinct species. And yeah, the question of what does that mean? So many of these were recorded within the historical networks we've talked about today. So when we think about the sounds of extinct birds, a species that you might think of is the Kauai-o'o, which has really kind of, the voice of the Kauai-o'o has really kind of traveled far and wide on the web as this kind of haunting kind of elegy to to extinction. And it really emphasizes, so I sort of talked a bit about the scientific power and the kind of conservation power of having recordings of extinct endangered species, but there's also this cultural power element too. So this is really apparent in the case of the Kauai-o-o, which is a small songbird or was a small songbird endemic to the island of Kauai. So there are several recordings of the Kauai-o-o that exist and that are available on the Macaulay Library website, but a particular famous one was recorded by Jim Jacoby in 1986. And the recording depicts a lone male Kauai-o-o. And importantly, the Kauai-o-o is a duetting species, but this recording is just of a lone male. And you can hear the male singing out to a mate with pauses in between left for a female to reply. But instead, there is silence. Seemingly, no one is left to respond. Like I mentioned, these recordings have really circulated widely online, with one YouTube remix, which I'm going to play in a minute, has 3.5 million views at the time of yesterday. Comments left under this video are really unusually ruminative for a YouTube comment section, with listeners lamenting the loss of this species and the sorrow that they feel can be heard in a lone male's voice. And actually, in my interviews that I did with scientists and artists and curators around extinction and sound, the Kauai-o-o came up again and again and again without me prompting it. And in fact, one quite prominent ornithologist actually told me that he struggled to listen to this recording without crying. That's how kind of emotional and meaningful it was for him. So I'm just going to play kind of an element of this remix now so that you can kind of get a picture of it if you haven't heard it before. Yeah, I hate to cut it off, and that one, it has been kind of processed to kind of extenuate those echoes. But yeah, as you can hear, it's this quite kind of moving and somewhat difficult to listen to piece. But when we think about what kind of having a recording of an extinct bird can do, in this case, it really does kind of emphasize what has been lost and what might still be lost as a result of extinction. So I've been talking for a whole hour. Oh my goodness. So we don't have time to talk about the Hawaiian Crow, but this is another really interesting example of a historical recording, which has sort of still had quite a prevalent role in the present day, with the re-release of Hawaiian crows into the wild, which is actually another re-release of the crows is going to happen within the next couple of weeks, which is but also there's quite a bit with William Ward around his entanglements with colonialism and bird sound recording too. But yes, alas, no time to talk about that there. But so come back to kind of this question of what it means to have recording of an extinct birds. And I've kind of, as I mentioned, went over a few kind of different things that it can do for us, kind of scientific and culturally. But kind of coming back to this question of when we usually think of extinction, what do we think of? Well, we usually think of skins or perhaps skeletons or taxidermy mounts or paintings, but now we have sound recordings. And what can those do for us? I would argue that I feel they have the potential and they do bring us closer to lost species. So this can be scientifically, such as in the case of the Ivory-billed Woodpecker, or culturally and kind of emotionally, in the case of the Kauai-o-o. And in fact, the sound recordings of extinction endangered birds have been really inspiring for many artists and curators. And I include an example here from Elizabeth Turk, who was a MacArthur Genius Grant winner, who was really compelled by recordings of extinction endangered birds and created these amazing, huge sculptures. I mean, this photo doesn't kind of do justice to how amazing these are, of the waveforms of these recordings. So the one on the right here is a kind of sculpture representation of that sound recording of the Ivory-billed Woodpecker. And yes, they can also help rediscovery efforts and potential to halt future extinctions. But overall, I really hope that this presentation, as kind of whistle-stop tour as it was, helped you to begin to hear wildlife sound recordings available on sites like the Macaulay Library as more than just neutral scientific data points. These are cultural historical artifacts with rich stories to tell about the relationship between people, birds, conservation, and power. And as more birds' voices are collected and as more bird species fall silent in the wild, listening to birds matters more than ever. But we must make sure we are listening closely, critically, and carefully. So I just have a few acknowledgements of some of the people and institutions who assisted me in this research, and particularly Marion for inviting me to speak to Land O'Lakes Bird Alliance here today. And I have included some references here, which are far too small for you to see, but if you would like to follow up to receive my slides or have any references or questions, feel free to email me anytime. Thank you so much for listening.
Wow, what a whistle-stop tour is a great descriptor. Thank you so much, Dr. Hunter. We do have a few minutes for questions. If you have a question about Dr. Hunter's talk or any of the birds or stories that were mentioned within the program, please enter them in the Q&A box, and I will try to read them off to Dr. Hunter. I had a quick question. You mentioned, you showed pictures of how obtrusive this early recording equipment was, and I was wondering, and also the fact that they were recording within a soundscape. And so with the last call, you said that it had been digitally altered to sort of bring the bird in question, like their call in the foreground and then background, the other bird calls. Does the Macaulay Library do that with any of their recordings, or is it usually done by other people who are researching or handling those recordings for a different purpose?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in that instance of the YouTube video, that was just kind of altered for, I guess, dramatic effect. But definitely when recordists would collect their recordings historically and in the present, and as well as when they donated them to the Macaulay Library, they would kind of alter them to emphasize the individual birds oftentimes. And that's actually been a critique that has been mounted by some kind of more like soundscape recordists, that a lot of the recording gear that we have and kind of recording methods we have are really focused on getting those recordings of those kind of honed in individual birds, which isn't really how the soundscape operates. And so yeah, but when we think about kind of scientific specimens, that's kind of the ways in which it was created, to kind of create like a sonic specimen of a creature. But yeah, more and more so people are kind of trying to create these more like soundscape recordings to get a gist of those two. But yeah.
Thank you. And then Austin asks, how long does it typically take for a bird to be unseen or unheard before it is considered extinct?
Yeah, that's a really big question because there's a lot of debate around that. There's this meme that I often show to students when I'm teaching them about extinction, which is this tweet where someone said, "How do you know it's extinct? Did you look everywhere?" or something like that. And it is hard to know because there's quite a lot of debate around that. There's this period scientifically which is known as gray extinction, which is often when a species kind of hasn't been seen or heard kind of conclusively for several decades, and it's sort of this like waiting period or this purgatory that species kind of exist in before they'll officially be declared extinct. But there are a ton of examples of species that have been officially declared extinct and then kind of pop up again. So yeah, it's kind of a question of what's the utility of saying whether a species is extinct or not. It can be kind of a funding issue because you don't kind of want to put money into conserving a species which isn't there. So by kind of declaring it extinct, you might free up funds for other species. Or it might be kind of a cultural, ecological reason that you want to call it extinct. But yeah, that's an ongoing debate, I guess I'll say.
And what is your personal thought about the existence of the ivory-billed? you've seen and heard the modern recordings and the correspondence?
Oh no. That's a tricky question, and I feel I have to it's interesting because as part of my research, I actually became pretty really into the world of ivory-bill searching. I interviewed several kind of modern ivory-bill searchers who then kind of invited me to some of their meetings, and I got to kind of know a lot of the folks in that area and just kind of understanding their experiences and the things that they've seen and heard. And I think oftentimes there's this kind of compulsion to think of ivory-bill searchers as being kind of kooky and all of these different things. But I think really what I saw is that these are just people who really are passionate about conservation, passionate about birds, passionate about protecting the southern wilderness. And yeah, I guess what I'll say is I very much believe that what I've been told, that people who believe that they've seen and heard them. And I think like there's a fair bit of interesting evidence that's coming out, and I guess I remain hopeful that they're still there. But I haven't been to the areas myself to kind of listen or look for them. So yeah.
Then someone says that your presentation was dynamite. I was prepared for a boring time, but you captured my imagination. What a wonderful impetus for conservation. Please keep speaking. Uh, and then I guess I had another question about when you mentioned that the only surviving recording of the ivory bills could be a warning call or a territorial vocalization. And then going back to those obtrusive recording instruments, are there any known recording captures in the library where like maybe the birds are not extinct and they haven't positively identified as that the birds are do not like being recorded or do not like having a big recording equipment around them, and that they have in fact just captured a bunch of alarm calls from birds?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of conversation around like the ethics of bird sound recording, kind of for that reason. Like in the same way that recently there's been a lot of debate around the ethics of bird photography and kind of crowding spaces where like owls are, for instance, and kind of bothering them, and so that you can get a better image. And that's definitely true for bird sound recording too, like kind of scaring birds or using playback to try and get a response. Um, and so there are certainly instances of that. I mean, there's so many recordings there that there are definitely instances of that too. And I think there are pushes kind of within the bird sound recording world to try and get people to not be so obtrusive when they record birds, both kind of ethically, but also from like a scientific utility perspective, that you want kind of birds to be behaving naturally and not like just responding to these unnatural impetuses to act.
Okay, we have time for I think one or two more questions if you want to put your questions in the chat. A philosophical question: do you think, besides having funding for uh, endangered birds versus a bird that has vanished, do you think there's a meaningful difference between a bird that's so endangered it's below its biological replacement rate and a bird that is extinct? Like what was the Hawaiian bird that was the last one?
Oh, the Kauai.
Hawaii, yeah. I was just thinking about like when numbers get that low, they might not be technically extinct, but
Yeah.
what you think about that, our desire to draw like a definitive line of extinct versus not, when these birds are like very clearly either completely wiped out or severely imperiled.
Yeah, that's something that comes up a lot when people talk about the ivory bill, because they say, well, if it is there, there's probably not very many of them there, so they probably won't be there for very long. But I guess like a side to that, I didn't have a chance to talk about the Hawaiian crow, but that's an example of a bird that was almost extinct and then kind of captured and is now being bred in captivity, right? So I guess that there's this argument that perhaps if we did find some left, then they could be saved that way. But then the question is, what are we releasing them back into? We're releasing them back into a place in which they can thrive and survive. But maybe like I think that extinction is a very powerful cultural concept for us for lots of different reasons, and maybe there's something productive about defining extinction because it kind of allows for this process of grieving, or kind of this kind of moment of reckoning of kind of what we or what kind of particular societies have done to the environment. So maybe it's kind of helpful in that sense. But yeah, it's an interesting philosophical question for sure.
Well, I think we're right at time, and I wanted to thank everyone for attending. Our next program is November 19th, and then we'll be talking about the ecological and biological history of American turkeys, specifically urban turkeys around Minneapolis. So we hope you tune in, and thank you so much to Dr. Hunter for your wonderful program on extinct bird sound recordings and its environmental history. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.